Welcome to my channel. Today, we step into a haunting night over Switzerland, where fog rolled through the valleys like a living thing, swallowing hills, lights, and even hope. This is the story of Crossair Flight 3597, a routine short-haul flight that took off with quiet confidence, carrying families, business travelers, and crew who had no idea that the sky waiting for them held a deadly secret. Tonight, we walk into the fog with them. We listen to the cockpit. We feel the tension. And we relive the night when a single mistake, mixed with darkness and confusion, would turn a calm descent into a tragedy that shook Zurich forever. The evening began peacefully in Berlin. Passengers moved through the terminal with winter coats zipped high against the night chill. Some held warm coffee, others dragged rolling bags behind them, ready to land in Zurich before midnight. Inside the cabin of the Avro RJ-100, flight attendants greeted people with warm smiles, unaware they would soon be part of a chain of events that could never be undone. The pilots prepared the cockpit carefully, reviewing charts, adjusting settings, and discussing the weather they would face upon arrival. Zurich was reporting heavy fog, dense enough to dim runway lights and swallow entire neighborhoods in silence. But for an experienced airline crew, fog was nothing new. They had done this hundreds of times. What they didn't know was that this night, the fog wasn't the only thing lowering visibility. A critical detail, quiet, hidden, buried inside those charts, was waiting to catch them off guard. As the aircraft climbed into the deep black sky, passengers settled in. Someone whispered a quiet prayer. A tired businessman leaned against the window, watching Berlin's lights disappear beneath the clouds. A young woman studying in Germany was excited to see her family again. In the cockpit, the pilots followed their routine, their voices calm, their tones steady. The hum of the engines wrapped the entire cabin in a soft vibration that lulled many to sleep. No one knew that the approach to Zurich would soon become one of the most confusing and stressful moments of their careers. The fog began forming a thick wall over the valleys, drifting upward like rising smoke. Controllers on the ground could barely see past their windows. Even radar screens felt colder, quieter, as if the whole airspace was holding its breath. Hours later, when Crossair 3597 started descending from cruising altitude, Zurich Tower radioed weather conditions that were worse than expected. Visibility was dropping fast. The primary runway was unavailable due to maintenance, forcing the pilots to use an alternative approach, an approach far more challenging, with tricky terrain and strict altitude rules that had to be followed precisely. Inside the cockpit, the captain assured the first officer that everything was manageable, but a small, subtle tension began to creep into the air. Pilots rely on visual cues when they break out of cloud layers, but tonight there would be none. Zurich was drowning in fog so thick it erased the horizon. Houses, hills, roads, rivers, everything blended into a single ghostly gray void. The crew should have had every reason to slow down and rely only on instruments, but the captain, confident from years of flying, believed he could find the runway visually the moment the plane dropped below the clouds. That confidence would soon become their biggest enemy. As the plane began its final descent, passengers remained calm, unaware that the cockpit was growing more stressful with every passing second. The flight attendants prepared for landing, collected cups, secured the galley, and took their seat. A few passengers shifted, sitting upright as they felt the aircraft lowering toward the earth. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and eerie, making the world outside look like nothingness. The first officer monitored instruments closely, calling out altitudes and cross-checking the approach path. But the captain insisted he had the runway in sight, even though the fog made it nearly impossible. A small voice inside the first officer felt something was wrong, something subtle, something hard to name, but the hierarchy of the cockpit kept him quiet longer than it should have. He trusted his captain. He trusted experience over doubt. And the night used that trust against them. The descent continued. The aircraft dropped lower and lower, its wings slicing through the heavy cloud layer. A warning chime echoed softly inside the cockpit, An altitude alert meant to remind them they were approaching minimum height. Zurich's alternate runway was surrounded by rising terrain, dark forests, and hills that climbed sharply beneath the fog. The approach required strict adherence to every altitude step. But the captain, believing he saw lights through the haze, dipped the nose slightly. The aircraft drifted below the safe descent path without anyone realizing how dangerously low they were. The ground beneath them was rising. The plane was sinking, and the fog, thick as a blanket, concealed the danger until it was almost too late. Inside the cabin, someone felt the descent becoming steeper. A woman gripped her armrest. A man glanced out the window into the shapeless gray nothing and felt a sudden unease. The engines hummed, steady but strained, as if the aircraft itself sensed a warning. In the cockpit, the first officer suddenly saw the altimeter dropping faster than expected. His voice trembled slightly as he called out their altitude again. This time, it didn't match what they should have been seeing. He urged the captain to check their approach profile. But by then, the aircraft had slipped so low that only seconds separated them from the rising terrain hidden below. A terrain warning system began to activate, its digital voice cold, urgent, echoing through the cockpit. Terrain, terrain, pull up. In that instant, the captain finally realized that what he thought were runway lights were just lights from a hillside town glowing faintly through the fog. The real runway was still far ahead, still invisible, and the plane was dangerously close to the ground. The cockpit erupted in immediate chaos. Engines thrust forward, controls pulled back, both pilots fighting to climb. Passengers inside felt a sudden roar, a tilt, a surge upward as the aircraft tried desperately to escape the terrain. But fate had closed the window. The fog masked everything. A line of trees stood directly in their path, and in the final moments the aircraft skimmed the tops of those trees, shearing through branches, sending violent shudders through the frame. A thunderous noise exploded as the wings struck the hillside. The cabin lights flickered. Screams filled the air. And in one horrifying instant, Crossair Flight 3597 broke apart in the darkness, scattered across the forest floor, leaving behind only the echoes of what should have been a simple winter landing. In the hours that followed, rescue teams battled dense fog, freezing cold, and unforgiving terrain to reach the wreckage. The hillside glowed with fire and debris, casting long shadows through the trees. Survivors cried out in shock, confusion, and unbearable pain. Firefighters moved through the destruction with flashlights, searching for life in the twisted metal. Investigators would later piece together a chilling truth. The flight had descended far below the required altitude because of a misjudgment, a dangerous reliance on visual cues, and a tragic underestimation of the fog's power. It was a reminder that even experienced pilots must trust instruments over instinct when darkness and weather combine into a deadly trap. Tonight, as we remember Crossair Flight 3597, we honor those who were lost, those who survived, and those who tried to reach them through the fog. Stories like this remind us why aviation safety continues to evolve, why procedures matter, and how small decisions can shape the fate of an entire flight. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of Switzerland's most heartbreaking aviation tragedies. If you found this story moving and want to hear more stories told with care and detail, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these memories alive. Begins as the night deepens over Switzerland, and the fog thickens like a living curtain wrapping itself around the mountains, swallowing towns, swallowing valleys, swallowing every clue the pilots desperately needed to stay safe. Crossair Flight 3597 continued descending through this ocean of gray, and the mood inside the cockpit shifted from calm professionalism to a quiet pressure that made the air feel heavy. The captain's voice, once steady and confident, began to carry small hints of strain as he talked through radio calls. The first officer kept glancing between instruments and the empty windows, hoping to catch even a glimpse of a familiar landmark, but the world outside had dissolved into something shapeless, something colorless, something that felt like a warning by itself. Deep inside the cabin, passengers felt the aircraft lowering too, but they trusted the crew, trusted the training, trusted the routine of a flight that had taken thousands of people safely across Europe. A woman near the back whispered to her sleeping child, adjusting his small blanket. A man reading a magazine stopped turning the pages when he felt a strange drop in the plane's movement. A few rows ahead, someone looked out the window and saw nothing but a milky wall of fog pressing against the glass. Even the wing lights were fading into it, as if the plane was drifting through a cloud without end. Inside the cockpit, the first officer checked the approach plate again, tracing each step of the descent path with his finger. The numbers were strict, unforgiving. Zurich's terrain sloped upward beneath them, meaning the aircraft should never fall below each designated altitude until they were almost over the runway threshold. But tonight, the captain truly believed he could break through the fog at the right moment and see the runway lights waiting for them. He leaned forward, staring into the gray void ahead, searching for the airport's glow. The first officer hesitated before gently offering a reminder about their altitude restrictions, but the captain brushed it off softly, insisting they were fine. The cockpit suddenly felt divided, one pilot trusting the instruments, the other trusting his instincts. Outside, the fog seemed to thicken even more, like it was absorbing the plane's lights, its sound, its presence. Everything felt quieter, heavier. The descent continued. The terrain below them was no longer flat. They were approaching rising hills and dark forests that hid beneath the fog like shadows waiting to be discovered too late. The altimeter crept downward. Their vertical speed increased slightly. The first officer shifted in his seat, sensing danger he couldn't yet fully articulate. He kept calling out their altitude, each number sounding more uneasy than the last. Meanwhile, passengers inside the cabin felt a subtle change, a slight shift in pressure, a faint rumble, a sensation they couldn't explain. A teenager listening to music pulled off his headphones and glanced around. A mother tightened her grip on her seatbelt. A businessman stopped typing on his laptop and stared forward, sensing an invisible tension filling the cabin. Back in the cockpit, the fog became so dense that even the faint glow of city lights below disappeared completely. The plane was flying blind, guided only by the cold accuracy of instruments that beeped quietly, faithfully, almost pleading to be trusted. The first officer noticed their altitude dropping below what the approach chart required. His voice cracked slightly as he repeated it, hoping the captain would correct their path. But the captain insisted he could see something ahead. A faint flicker, a distant light, a shimmering glow fighting through the fog. He leaned closer, convinced, determined, unaware that the lights he saw belonged to a small hillside village, not the runway at Zurich. The aircraft dipped even lower. The distance between the wheels and the rising terrain narrowed with each passing second. The ground proximity warning system remained silent, for now, because they were still above the trigger point, but dangerously close to slipping beneath it. The first officer's breathing grew sharp and quiet. He sensed that something was wrong, very wrong, but the chain of authority inside the cockpit held him back from pushing harder. He watched the gray void ahead and felt a strange uneasiness, the kind that crawls up your spine when you're approaching something unseen but deadly. In the cabin, the descent felt different now. Steeper. Heavier. People began looking around, noticing that the usual final approach didn't feel like this. The fog outside had become so thick it felt like the plane was falling into a cloud of smoke. The engines hummed steadily, but beneath that hum, something in the rhythm of the aircraft felt off, something only human instinct could recognize even without cockpit information. A woman whispered a quiet prayer under her breath. A young man gripped his seatbelt a little tighter. A flight attendant, buckled into her jump seat, felt her heartbeat rising as she looked down the narrow aisle, imagining the cockpit filled with pressure she could not see. The plane drifted downward. The hillside below them waited silently. And in that long, terrifying descent, the fate of Crossair Flight 3597 was being written second by second, inch by inch, all inside a fog so thick it hid every warning until the very moment it was too late. Begins at the moment when the descent shifts from uneasy to dangerous, when the cockpit of Crossair Flight 3597 becomes a quiet battlefield between instincts and instruments, between confidence and reality, between what the captain believed he saw and what the world outside was actually hiding. The fog around them grew thicker, darker, swallowing even the faintest hope of visual cues, wrapping the aircraft in an isolated cocoon that made the cockpit feel smaller, tighter, more suffocating. The captain leaned forward, still convinced that the runway would reveal itself just seconds ahead, while the first officer's eyes scanned the altimeter again and again, watching the numbers fall below the safe minima, feeling his stomach twist with every foot of altitude they lost. The charts told them they should not go any lower. The instruments silently begged them to level off. But the human desire to see something, anything, beyond that window had taken hold. Inside the cabin, passengers sensed the descent becoming heavier, as if the aircraft was sinking into the earth instead of approaching it. Someone gripped the overhead compartment as turbulence tapped lightly against the fuselage. Another passenger closed her eyes tightly, feeling a strange pressure building in her ears that didn't feel normal. A flight attendant glanced around nervously from her jump seat, her instincts whispering that something about this approach wasn't right. A few seats back, an elderly man clutched the armrests, whispering under his breath as the engines changed pitch in a way he had never heard on a landing before. The fog pressed harder on the windows, making them look like walls of gray concrete rather than transparent glass. Even the wingtip lights were lost, swallowed by the swirling white abyss. In the cockpit, the first officer suddenly called out another altitude check, this time with urgency in his voice. They were far below where they should have been at that stage of the approach. The captain responded tersely, insisting he had the situation under control, insisting he had visual contact with the runway environment ahead. But the truth was far darker. The lights he thought he saw belonged not to the airport, but to scattered houses clinging to the rising hillside below, a hillside they were now dangerously close to. The first officer hesitated, torn between respect and fear, wanting to speak up but unable to push his voice hard enough to override the captain's authority. And in those few seconds of hesitation, the aircraft slipped even lower. Then, in the cockpit, a sound broke the tension. The faintest, shortest warning chirp from the ground proximity system, like a whisper before a scream. The first officer's eyes widened. He knew what that meant. He called out again, louder this time, almost pleading for them to climb. The captain's confidence cracked just slightly as he glanced down at the instruments and realized the runway should have appeared by now. The fog was too thick. The lights were too dim. The world outside was completely gone. And suddenly, the truth hit him. They were below the glide path, dangerously below. The GPWS warning erupted fully now, filling the cockpit with a harsh, mechanical voice shouting terrain, terrain, pull up. The captain reacted instantly, shoving the throttle forward, pulling back on the controls, fighting to lift the aircraft away from the unseen hillside. Inside the cabin, passengers felt the sudden lurch of power, the engines roaring, the nose of the plane rising sharply. People gasped. Someone screamed. A flight attendant braced her legs harder. A man shouted, "What's happening?" as the aircraft tilted upward violently. But the fog was merciless. The hillside beneath them climbed just as quickly. Trees, tall and dark, stood silently waiting in the mist, invisible until the final second. The aircraft's belly rushed toward them, too low, too fast, too late. Inside the cockpit, the captain pulled harder, but the plane responded with the sluggish heaviness of a machine trying to outrun fate. And then, through the dense fog, the first officer saw something. Just a flicker, a shape, a dark cluster rising out of the whiteness. His heart stopped. The hillside. Right there. Right in front of them. A half-second later, the aircraft's wings sliced through the treetops, ripping through branches with a violent, tearing howl that shook the entire fuselage. The cockpit jolted, lights flickered, metal bent and screamed. The cabin exploded in gasps and terrified cries as the plane shuddered violently, pieces tearing away into the forest below. In that moment, hope and terror collided in the darkness, and the fate of Flight 3597 became sealed in a single heartbeat. Begins at the exact moment terror becomes real, when the first violent scrape of metal against branches shatters the illusion of control and Crossair Flight 3597 plunges from uncertainty into catastrophe. The aircraft, still swallowed in thick fog, shook so violently that passengers felt as if the entire world tilted sideways. A fireball of panic erupted inside the cabin as overhead bins burst open, sending bags flying through the air like weightless projectiles. Screams echoed against the narrow walls, raw, terrified, human, cries of adults, gasps of children, desperate prayers from passengers who suddenly understood that something was terribly, impossibly wrong. Inside the cockpit, the captain fought the controls with everything he had, gripping them so tightly his hands trembled. The first officer's eyes were wide with horror as the plane continued clipping treetops, each impact ripping more metal, snapping branches, filling the cockpit with flashes of sparks and shadowy silhouettes of trees rushing past too quickly to comprehend. The GPWS continued to scream its warning, louder and more frantic with every second. Pull up! Pull up! Pull up! But the earth was rising faster than the plane could climb, and the engine strained with a desperate roar that sounded like a dying plea. In the cabin, a woman clutched her child to her chest, shielding him with her body as oxygen masks swung above them, swaying uselessly because there was no time for anyone to reach for one. A man braced his feet against the floor, gripping the seat in front of him so hard that his knuckles went white, his mind spinning, wondering how a quiet night flight had turned into this nightmare. Near the back, a flight attendant fought tears as the fuselage shook again, the plane's right wing hitting a thicker group of trees that tore into the metal like claws. The entire aircraft jolted to the side, sending passengers slamming into armrests and windows, the sound of cracking glass mixing with shouts of fear. Sparks burst from under the right wing, lighting the fog with quick flashes of orange and white that disappeared just as quickly as they appeared. The hillside was no longer something distant and hidden, it was right below them, right beside them, a dark, rising force that the plane could not outrun. For a brief moment, the aircraft managed to lift slightly, almost as if trying to break free from the forest's grip, but the damage from the wing strike had already crippled its lift. The engines roared again in a defiant cry, but the Avro RJ-100 was bleeding speed, bleeding altitude, bleeding hope. The cockpit shuddered violently as alarms flashed red, and the captain shouted commands louder than he had spoken all night, his voice raw with urgency, fear, and determination. The first officer tried to assist, but the controls felt heavy, unresponsive, as if the plane itself was collapsing under the weight of gravity and damage. Then, in a single horrifying instant, the aircraft's left wing clipped another large tree, this time with enough force to rip away a massive portion of the structure. The plane lurched violently left, rolling slightly, the sudden tilt causing everything inside the cabin to shift like a wave crashing against a shore. Passengers screamed as the left side dropped, windows flashing with the shadows of trees flashing by inches from their faces. A terrible grinding noise filled the cabin, a metallic shriek that drowned out everything else. In the cockpit, the first officer's final desperate words hung in the air, his voice a mix of disbelief and despair. The plane's nose pitched downward slightly, only a few degrees, but enough to seal the final seconds of its fate. The fog thickened even more, as if the night itself was closing in around them, turning the world into a tunnel of gray that hid the hillside rushing toward the fuselage. The aircraft plowed through several more trees, each impact shaking the plane harder, ripping off panels, tearing open seams in the fuselage that allowed icy night air to roar inside. The cabin became a wind tunnel of panic and noise, with loose objects flying everywhere. Someone cried out for help. Someone else whispered goodbye. A flight attendant braced for impact with shaking hands clasped together. And then, the final moment arrived. A massive tree, hidden until the last split second, slammed into the underside of the fuselage, causing the aircraft to pitch forward, the nose dropping sharply as the hillside rose to meet it. The plane's belly hit the ground with a thunderous explosion of dirt, metal, and fire. The impact tore the aircraft apart in seconds, the fuselage splitting as it slid against the forest floor, sparks erupting as metal scraped earth, trees snapping under the force, pieces of the plane scattering through the darkness like falling stars. Flames burst from the ruptured fuel lines, lighting the fog with a fiery glow that could be seen miles away by those who had no idea what had just happened. The world went silent for a moment as the broken wreckage lay scattered across the hillside, fire crackling softly through the twisted remains, the night still, heavy, heart-wrenchingly quiet, and the tragic fate of Crossair Flight 3597 fully sealed beneath the fog. Begins in the seconds after the crash, when the roaring chaos suddenly collapses into a hollow, haunting silence broken only by the crackle of small fires burning through the wreckage. The forest, moments ago torn apart by a violently crashing aircraft, stood eerily still as the fog hung low over the broken fuselage, its gray veil glowing faintly from the flames licking at torn metal. Survivors inside the shattered remains of Crossair Flight 3597 struggled to process what had happened. Some were thrown forward, others pinned, and many sat in shock, unable to understand why the world had stopped moving. A woman who had been clutching her child just minutes earlier found herself lying sideways on the forest floor, her head ringing, her heart pounding as she desperately searched for her son's voice in the darkness. A man stumbled through the torn cabin, his legs trembling, his breath shallow, calling out for anyone who could hear him. The air smelled of fuel, burnt wiring, and cold earth. The fog swirled around them, amplifying the confusion, muting distant cries until they felt like fading echoes. Somewhere near the front of the plane, the cockpit was crushed beyond recognition, twisted into the hillside with a violence that left rescuers no chance of finding it intact. The first officer's final moments were lost inside the mangled metal, while the captain's last desperate attempt to save the aircraft now lay in ruins around him. But in the scattered, broken cabin, small pockets of life remained. A young flight attendant crawled out from under a fallen ceiling panel, her hands shaking as she tried to stand, screaming hoarsely for passengers to stay awake, stay calm, hold on. She had no idea where she was. All she could see were flames flickering off tree trunks, fog drifting like smoke, and pieces of the plane lying everywhere like shattered memories. Survivors groaned and cried out in pain. Some were too injured to move, pinned by twisted seats or metal beams, their voices weak but full of desperation. Others staggered out of openings in the fuselage, barefoot, bleeding, confused, the cold night air biting into their skin as they tried to escape the growing flames. The forest around them seemed endless and dark, every direction swallowed by fog, making it impossible to tell which way safety lay. Meanwhile, many kilometers away, phones in Zurich's emergency center began to ring. Controllers, already uneasy from losing radar contact with the flight, now faced the chilling realization that something terrible had happened. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue helicopters were scrambled immediately, but even with sirens blazing, the thick fog turned the night into a maze. Helicopters couldn't fly low enough to search. The ground crews struggled to navigate the winding forest roads. Every minute felt like an hour as survivors waited in the cold darkness, clinging to life. Back at the crash site, a man in his 20s knelt beside a woman who couldn't move her legs. He held her hand, promising help was coming, even though he wasn't sure he believed it. A mother called her daughter's name again and again, her voice cracking under the weight of fear. A teenage boy limped through the trees, disoriented, unaware that he was leaving a trail of blood behind him as he searched for anyone else still alive. The fog made every sound unclear, turning cries into distant whispers, turning footsteps into eerie echoes. Hours felt like eternity. And then, faintly at first, a distant light flickered through the fog, a flashlight beam cutting through the gray. Rescue teams had finally arrived. Firefighters shouted as they climbed through the forest, their boots crunching on broken branches, their breath visible in the freezing air. They followed the glow of the flames until they reached the scattered wreckage, their faces tightening with horror as they realized the scale of the tragedy. They moved quickly, pulling survivors from twisted openings, cutting through metal with hydraulic tools, lifting debris with trembling urgency. One firefighter knelt beside a woman trapped under a collapsed seat row, holding her hand as she sobbed in fear, promising she wouldn't be alone. Another firefighter reached into a torn section of the fuselage and lifted a child still breathing, still conscious, whispering softly to calm him as he carried him into the night. The hillside, once quiet, became a chaotic mosaic of rescue lights, smoke, fog, and human emotion. Investigators would arrive later, stunned by the shattered remains of the aircraft stretched across the forest like a tragic trail. They would walk through the debris, their flashlights illuminating charred metal, broken wings, personal belongings scattered over the ground, shoes, passports, torn jackets, a child stuffed bear burned at the edges. They would piece together the heartbreaking truth of what had happened, but for now, all that mattered was saving those who still clung to life. And as the fog finally began to thin with the approaching dawn, the full shape of the disaster emerged, a silent testimony to confusion, misjudgment, and the unforgiving nature of the night. Crossair Flight 3597 lay broken on the hillside, but its survivors, though shaken and scarred, were proof that even in disaster's darkest moment, hope can still breathe among the ruins. Begins as dawn finally breaks over the Swiss hillside, revealing the heartbreaking truth that the fog had hidden through the long, terrifying night. Sunlight filtered weakly through the mist, casting pale gold across the forest and illuminating the scattered wreckage of Crossair Flight 3597 in a way that felt almost unreal, like a frozen moment from a nightmare. Rescue teams, who had worked tirelessly through the night, paused for a quiet breath as they watched the world slowly come into focus. Firefighters stood with soot on their faces, their eyes red from cold, exhaustion, and the emotional toll of digging through wreckage for survivors. Paramedics knelt beside stretchers, checking pulses, covering the lost with blankets, comforting the living with soft words and gentle hands. Survivors, wrapped in thermal foil blankets, shivered not just from the cold but from shock, their faces pale, their eyes wide and distant, trying to make sense of the horror they had witnessed. Some cried quietly. Some stared blankly at the ground. Some clung to rescuers as if letting go meant losing their last connection to safety. In those early morning hours, the forest was silent except for the faint crackle of extinguished fires, the murmur of radios, and the soft sobs of those who realized a miracle had allowed them to live when so many others had not. When investigators finally walked the site, their boots sinking into the damp earth, they were confronted with the full, devastating path the aircraft had carved through the trees. They traced the trail of torn branches and snapped trunks, noting the places where the plane first struck the forest canopy, marking each impact point with quiet solemnity. They recorded where the wings had broken, where the fuselage had split, where debris scattered like shattered memories across the hillside. They found cockpit instruments crushed beyond recognition, seat rows torn from their anchors, personal belongings that once meant everything to their owners now lying in silence. A wedding ring, a broken watch, a passport smudged with mud, a child's toy missing an arm. Investigators walked slowly, taking notes, fighting back emotion, understanding the weight of every step they took. Soon, the true story of what happened became painfully clear. The descent profile had not been followed. Altitudes were missed. The captain had descended below minimums without runway visual contact. The dense fog had stolen every cue he needed, tricking him into believing village lights were the runway. The first officer had hesitated to challenge him, a quiet reminder of the dangerous consequences of cockpit hierarchy. The rising terrain, hidden beneath the fog, had given the crew no chance once the aircraft sank below safety threshold. It was a tragedy built from human pressure, weather, misjudgment, and impossible visibility, an accident where one wrong assumption became the tipping point for everything that followed. In Zurich, families gathered at the airport, anxiously waiting for news, many already sensing the heartbreak they were about to face. Some clutched each other, praying. Others paced in silence. When the official word arrived, tears fell, voices cracked, and the room filled with a grief so heavy that even the walls seemed to absorb it. For the families of those who survived, relief mixed with disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. For the families of those who didn't, the world shifted in an instant. Television reporters stood outside in the cold morning air, delivering the tragic updates, their breath visible as they described the conditions, the fog, the crash, the rescue efforts. Across Europe, people watched in sadness, imagining the fear passengers must have felt, imagining the darkness, the fog, the last desperate moments. In the weeks that followed, investigators published their findings and aviation authorities took immediate steps to strengthen procedures. Approach charts were revised. Training protocols for crew coordination were tightened. Minimum descent altitudes became stricter for difficult terrain approaches. The accident became a wake-up call for airlines everywhere, reminding them that confidence can be dangerous, that fog can hide more than just the runway, and that altitude minima exist to save lives. Memorials were held on the hillside, where flowers were placed on tree stumps and names were read aloud with trembling voices. Survivors returned to the crash site months later, overwhelmed by the sight of the forest growing back around them, new green leaves covering the scars of the trees, nature quietly reclaiming the land where their lives had nearly ended. Some dropped to their knees and wept. Others lit candles, whispering thank you to the rescuers who fought the fog that night. The memory of Crossair Flight 3597 became a solemn chapter in aviation safety, a story told not just through wreckage reports, but through the voices of those who lived to tell what they saw, felt, and survived. And as we stand here today, retelling this story, we honor every life touched by that night. The ones lost, the ones saved, the ones who risked everything to reach the wreckage, and the ones who still carry the memories. Thank you for spending this time with me, remembering a night when fog, confusion, and fate intersected in the quiet hills near Zurich. If this story moved you, and you'd like to hear more stories told with the same care, depth, and respect, feel free to subscribe to the channel. It means more than you know, and it helps keep these important stories alive.